Welcome to this deep dive
Oh,
into Thelema.
okay.
And specifically this time we're going to be looking at the Holy Books of Thelema.
Sounds good.
So you've shared with me some excerpts
Yeah.
from a 1983 publication from the Ordo Templi Orientis,
Oh, right.
or as they're better known, OTO.
Yep.
Which seems to be like a mix of catalog and analysis of these mystical texts.
Yeah, it's like they've given us a map to a hidden library, secret library of spiritual wisdom.
I like that. Okay, so before we jump into the Holy Books,
Okay.
just for any listeners out there who might not be familiar with Thelema itself,
Right.
it's a spiritual philosophy that kind of popped up in the early 20th century, and it's very much tied to the infamous occultist Aleister Crowley.
Right. And the OTO is a mystical order that Crowley was heavily involved with.
Yeah, and that's the organization behind our source material.
Exactly.
So these books aren't just like, regular writings to Thelemites.
Well,
these are direct transmissions.
Just direct transmissions of like divine wisdom or something.
Yeah.
And what I think is really interesting is that this idea of textual purity runs right through Thelema.
Oh.
And, this OTO publication even uses the term Class A
Right.
to designate texts which are considered to be so sacred that you can't alter not so much as the style of a letter.
Really? They can't even change the font?
No.
Wow.
The belief is that even the physical form of the text holds hidden mysteries.
Oh, that's wild.
No.
Okay, so speaking of central texts,
Yeah.
we have to talk about Liber Legis,
Right.
also known as the Book of the Law.
Right.
This is like the foundational text of Thelema.
Absolutely.
Received by Crowley in 1904.
1904. Yep.
And the story of how he received it is
Pretty dramatic.
pretty wild.
Yeah. Crowley describes being contacted by a being named Aiwass,
Okay.
whose voice seemed to be coming from like a corner of the room.
Oh, wow.
And Crowley said that Aiwass had like the face of a savage king with veiled eyes
He's bookie.
and spoke with this incredible urgency.
Okay.
Like he was on a really tight deadline.
So this Aiwass sounds pretty intense.
Oh, yeah. Crowley even felt like Aiwass was actually in the room with him.
Right?
Like in a body that was made of some kind of fine matter.
Okay.
Almost like a veil or a gauze or something.
I think I was just totally freaked out.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Well, Aiwass dictated Liber Legis to Crowley over 3 days.
Oh, wow.
And get this, Aiwass gave very specific instructions
Okay.
on how the book had to be reproduced verbatim on similar materials,
Wow.
even carried through to translations.
So even back then they were worried about somebody, hitting cradle plus C, cradle plus V and changing the meaning of things.
Like this focus on preserving the exact form of the text
Yeah.
just underscores how much importance Thelemites placed on Liber Legis right from the start. Not just the content, but the actual physical form itself was considered sacred.
That's wild. Okay, so we've got this central text, Liber Legis, which is this direct transmission from this being Aiwass.
Yes, mysterious Aiwass.
But our source material actually lists a bunch of other holy books, too.
It does. Yeah, think of it like there's a whole library filled with these different chapters of Thelemic wisdom.
Okay, so tell me about these.
Each book has its own story, its own kind of mysteries to unravel.
Okay, spill the tea.
All right, so for example, there's Liber B Vel Magi, or the Book of the Magus. And the interesting thing about this one is that Crowley was surprised when he received it. Because at that point, he didn't think that he would ever achieve the grade of Magus, which is the spiritual level that's described in the text.
So it was like prepping him for a future role he hadn't even thought of yet?
Yeah, exactly, like a prophecy almost.
Wow.
Then you've got Liber the Seventh,
Okay.
or the Book of Lapis Lazuli, which is known for its unique language.
Okay.
It's described as the birth words of a master of the temple.
Okay, so what does that mean?
So think of a master of the temple as this spiritual adept who has reached a very high level of understanding and mastery within the Thelemic system.
Okay.
And Liber the Seventh is said to be connected to the 7 planets,
Okay.
each representing different aspects of existence.
So we're getting into like really esoteric territory now?
We are, and the source material even says that the full understanding of Liber Seventh is concealed from everyone except a select few.
Wow.
So there's like a whole other layer of hidden meaning there just waiting to be discovered.
Okay, so we've got Liber B Vel Magi.
Yeah.
We've got Liber the Seventh.
Well, right.
You said there's Liber X.
There's Liber X.
Liber, LXV.
Liber, LXV, Liber, LXV.
Okay, hold on.
Okay.
I'm already trying to wrap my head around all of this. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's stick with Liber B, Vel Magi, and Liber the Seventh for now.
Yeah.
What else is important about these?
Well, I think it's important to remember Crowley's role in all this.
Okay.
He considered himself to be more of a vehicle, like a channel for these writings rather than their author.
Why?
He believed he was receiving these texts from a higher source. And in fact, his magical motto, VVVV,
and what does that stand for?
appears frequently throughout the Holy Books.
Okay. And what does that stand for, just out of curiosity?
It stands for, by the force of truth, I have conquered the universe while living.
That's pretty powerful.
It is. And it really underscores the Thelemic emphasis on personal will and seeking truth.
So if Crowley wasn't the author of these books,
right,
where did they really come from?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
You know, to understand that we need to take a look at Crowley's journey through other mystical orders, like the Golden Dawn and the AA. These experiences really shaped his understanding of magic and spirituality, and ultimately led him to the reception of the Holy Books and the founding of Thelema.
Okay, so lots of mystical adventures and secret societies.
Yeah.
Okay, before we get too deep into that rabbit hole, you mentioned earlier that there were some controversies. About...
We can't forget those.
Yeah, about what constitutes a holy book.
Exactly, because remember how we were talking about textual purity?
Right.
Well, in Thelema, there's actually a lot of debate about what truly constitutes a holy book.
Okay, so it's not as clear-cut as saying these are the holy books.
No, not at all. You see, there are a couple of books.
Okay.
Liber CDXV, the Paris Working, and Liber CDX8, the Vision and the Voice, that initially contain material classified as Class A.
So divinely inspired.
Meaning divinely inspired, yeah.
So what's the problem?
Here's the catch. These books were later excluded from the strict definition of holy books because they also contain Crowley's personal notes and experiences.
So it's like somebody doodled in the margins of the sacred text.
Exactly. So it's back to that emphasis on textual purity again.
Yeah, so the divine message had to be pure, unfiltered.
Unfiltered by any human interpretation or addition.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does a book actually get classified as a holy book?
That is the question.
Yeah. And are there any other examples of texts that kind of like walk that line between, you know, holy and human?
Well, you've hit on a really important point. This distinction between what's considered to be purely divine and what's been influenced by human interpretation.
Right.
It's a key debate in Thelema.
It's sort of like trying to figure out, you know, which stories in the Bible were meant to be taken literally.
That's a great analogy.
And which ones weren't. Yeah,
and it brings us to another fascinating case, the style of revealing.
Okay.
Now, this ancient Egyptian artifact is actually mentioned in Liber Legis. And plays a significant role in Thelema. But it is not considered a Class A text.
Okay, now I'm really curious.
Yeah.
Why not?
That's where this whole idea of authorship and transmission gets even more complex. You see, the still itself isn't a book or a written text in the traditional sense. It's an ancient Egyptian funerary stele. Dating all the way back to the 26th dynasty.
Wow.
It features a priest of Mentu.
Okay, wait, back up a second. What's Mentu?
Mentu was an ancient Egyptian god of war. And the stele is basically a record of this priest's life, Ankefren Khonsu, his name was, and his journey into the afterlife.
Okay, so how does this ancient Egyptian stele connect to...
A good question.
Liber Legis and Thelema, which emerged, you know, thousands of years later.
Well, according to Crowley, the stele was discovered in a museum in Cairo, and he felt this immediate, powerful connection to it. He believed it was a visual representation of some of the key concepts in Liber Legis, and that it provided further validation of the divine origin of Thelema.
So if it's so important, why isn't it considered a Class A text?
The distinction comes down to how the text was received. Liber Legis was directly dictated to Crowley by a seemingly supernatural entity, while the style is an ancient artifact with its own history and layers of interpretation.
So it's all about
And speaking of interpretation, the source material actually provides several different translations and analyses of the style.
You mentioned earlier there was the original French translation and then a newer one from the 1980s.
Exactly.
That's pretty interesting.
It is, because it shows how interpretations can evolve over time as our understanding of language and history changes.
Yeah. It's like
what might have seemed clear or straightforward 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's like how people are constantly reinterpreting Shakespeare.
Exactly. It highlights the fact that even when we're dealing with supposedly fixed texts, meaning is fluid and always subject to change.
Okay, so what are some of the key phrases on the stele that might pique a listener's interest?
Well, there are a few that really stand out.
Okay.
For example, Anka Fenkansu proclaims his innocence, stating, "Do not stand up against me as a witness." He also claims to have joined those who were in the light and opened the abode of the stars.
Wow.
And then there's this very mysterious reference to the one who has only one arm who shines in the moon.
Who is that one-armed moon-shining person?
It does sound like something straight out of a myth.
Yeah, it does.
There are lots of different theories and interpretations about who or what this figure might represent, adding yet another layer of intrigue to the stele. But what's clear is that the stele adds a whole other dimension to our understanding of Thelema and its potential connections to ancient Egyptian mysticism.
It definitely makes you wonder about all the historical connections that might be hidden beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And speaking of connections, we can't forget about the AA, which plays a crucial role in Thelema.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier. It's a magical order, right?
It is.
But what does AA actually stand for?
Well, it's often said to stand for Argentium Astrum, which means silver star in Latin. But, like many things in Thelema, the true meaning is often hidden or veiled in symbolism. What's important is that the AA is a magical order focused on spiritual development and helping individuals to reach their highest potential.
So it's all about?
And our source material tells us that Liber LXI, Liber Kaze, is especially important for understanding the history and purpose of the A.
So what does Liber LXI tell us?
Well, in essence, it's to guide individuals towards their unknown crown, which is basically their highest spiritual potential. The truest version of themselves.
So they're big on self-discovery. What about Crowley? Wasn't he a leader in the AA?
That's an interesting point, because while Crowley was undoubtedly a key figure in the AA, the order actually believes very strongly in non-interference.
So how does that work?
The idea is that adepts, or those who have reached a high level within the order, act as guides, but they don't force or control others on their spiritual journeys. Each individual has to overcome their own obstacles and confront their own illusions.
So it's more about empowerment than blind obedience.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility for your own spiritual growth. But you're right to bring up Crowley's personality. Because, you know, as you might imagine, the AA, like many organizations, has had its share of internal conflict and power struggles.
I bet, especially with somebody like Crowley.
The source material even mentions that there were clashes between individuals who had different interpretations of Thelema or in different ideas about how the order should be run.
So even in the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment,
it seems that human nature always has a role to play.
Even in spiritual endeavors.
Even in spiritual endeavors.
Okay, so before we move on to part 2 here. I'm just curious. From all of this stuff that we've talked about so far, what are some of the things that stand out to you?
What stands out to me is, you know, all this talk about textual purity and divine inspiration makes me wonder about the actual content of these books.
What are they actually about?
Like, what kind of wisdom or guidance do they offer?
It's
a great question.
And
it's one that every Thelemite grapples with in their own way. You know, the themes vary quite a bit. From practical instructions on magical practices to deep philosophical reflections on the nature of reality and the self.
So it's not just a rule book.
No, it's more like a guide to living a Thelemic life. And remember how we talked about Crowley's motto? VVV, by the force of truth, I have conquered the universe while living. Well, that idea of personal will and the pursuit of truth pops up again and again throughout the Holy Books.
So it's not about blind faith or dogma.
It's about finding your own truth.
Gotcha. And what about
And another recurring theme is this idea of duality.
Okay.
Of opposites.
Like what?
Like light and darkness,
right.
male and female.
Right.
These seemingly opposing forces are constantly being explored in the Holy Books.
Okay, so like the yin and yang symbol.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about finding balance and integrating these different aspects within yourself.
Okay.
And that process of integration often involves confronting what's called the shadow self.
Okay.
The darker, hidden parts of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, now you're speaking my language.
Are we?
Yeah. This reminds me of the Brothers of the Left-Hand Path.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier.
That we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And in some esoteric traditions, the left-hand path is associated with going against the grain, questioning societal norms, and even embracing taboo practices as a means of achieving spiritual power.
So it's not necessarily about being evil or bad.
Not necessarily.
It's just about like exploring the unconventional.
It's about pushing boundaries and challenging the status quo.
Okay.
But it's important to note this is just one interpretation.
Right.
Thelema, like any spiritual system, is open to individual understanding and application.
Right. So there's no one right way to do it.
There's no one right way to do it.
Okay. So we've got this emphasis on textual purity.
Right.
This focus on personal will and truth-seeking, and then these explorations of duality and integration.
Yeah.
What's the overall point of all this?
If we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, Thelema seems to be about empowering the individual.
Okay.
And helping them to realize their full potential.
And I think it's interesting how, Thelema literally translates to will.
That's right. It's about discovering and aligning with your true will, your purpose, and living a life that's in harmony with it.
That sounds like a pretty empowering philosophy.
It is.
Yeah.
But there's also a strong emphasis on taking responsibility for your actions and their consequences.
No blaming the universe for your problems.
No blaming the universe.
So in Thelema, you're really in the driver's seat of your own life.
Absolutely. You create your own reality. Right. And the Holy Books are like a roadmap for that journey.
Okay.
They offer tools and insights to help you to navigate the complexities of life and to tap into your full potential.
So even with all this talk about divine inspiration and textual purity, it still comes down to individual interpretation.
Exactly. And that's perhaps the most important takeaway from all of this.
Okay. There's no one right way to understand or practice Thelema.
Okay.
These texts are meant to spark your own inner journey. They're a starting point for exploration and self-discovery.
And that journey might take you in some unexpected directions.
Definitely, because Thelema doesn't shy away from challenging conventional morality and societal norms.
Yeah, that was one thing that really jumped out at me from the excerpt you shared.
Yeah.
It seemed like sexuality was a big theme.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Thelema views sexuality as a powerful force that can be harnessed for spiritual growth.
That's pretty different from a lot of other traditions.
It is. But it also raises some important questions about the ethical implications of such teachings.
Right.
How do you balance personal freedom with the potential for harm?
It's like the old saying, your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins.
Exactly. And this is a tension that every Thelemite has to grapple with on their own terms.
Okay.
There are no easy answers here.
Thelema is a system that demands active engagement, critical thinking, and a willingness to constantly question and evolve.
Okay, well, it sounds like we've only just scratched the surface of this topic.
We have. There's so much more to explore.
Yeah.
The symbolism, the rituals.
Right.
The history, the impact of Thelema on modern culture.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating world waiting to be discovered.
It's like we've been given a key to this secret library.
Yeah.
Filled with ancient wisdom and powerful knowledge.
Exactly.
So stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive on the Holy Books of Thelema.
Absolutely. Okay, so where were we?
Well, last time we were talking about how these books came to be, and we were talking about
the textual purity.
Yeah, textual purity.
And how even Crowley's own writings weren't considered to be holy books because they weren't pure enough.
Right, like Liber CDXV and Liber CDX8.
Yeah, exactly.
They were later excluded.
Because they included too much of Crowley's own stuff.
Right, his own kind of human experiences and things.
So the divine message had to be pure.
Right.
Unfiltered by any human interpretation or addition.
Yeah. Which I think is kind of interesting because it makes me wonder, like, how do you even know what's divine and what's not?
That is the question. Yeah. And that actually leads us to another really interesting example, the Stela of Revealing.
Oh, yeah. You mentioned this earlier.
Now, this is an ancient Egyptian artifact, which is actually mentioned in Liber Legis.
Okay.
And it plays a significant role in Thelema.
Okay.
But it's not considered to be a Class A text.
Why not? If it's mentioned in Liber Legis, I would think it would be like equally important.
That's where this whole idea of authorship and transmission gets even more complex.
Okay.
You see, the stele itself isn't a book or a written text in the traditional sense.
Right.
It's an ancient Egyptian funerary stele dating all the way back to the 26th dynasty. It features a priest of Mentu.
Wait, what's Mentu?
Mentu was an ancient Egyptian god of war.
Okay.
And the stele is basically a record of this priest's life.
Okay.
His name was Ankhefunkhonsu.
Ankhefunkhonsu.
And his journey into the afterlife.
So how does this ancient Egyptian still connect to
Good question.
Liber Legis and Thelema?
Yeah, it's thousands of years apart.
Yeah.
So according to Crowley, the stele was discovered in a museum in Cairo.
Okay.
And he felt this immediate, powerful connection to it.
Okay.
He believed it was a visual representation of some of the key concepts in Liber Legis, and that it provided further validation of the divine origin of Thelema.
So if it's so important to Thelema, why isn't it considered a Class A text?
Well, the distinction, I think, comes down to how the text was received.
Okay.
Liber Legis was directly dictated to Crowley by a seemingly supernatural entity, while the stele is an ancient artifact with its own history and layers of interpretation.
Right, so it's...
And speaking of interpretation, the source material actually provides several different translations and analyses of the stele.
Oh, that's right. You mentioned that before.
Yeah.
There was an original French translation and then a newer one from the 1980s.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it really shows how interpretations can evolve over time.
Right.
You know, as our understanding of language and history changes.
Right.
What might have seemed like clear or straightforward 100 years ago could have a completely different meaning today.
Yeah, like how people are constantly reinterpreting Shakespeare for modern audiences.
Exactly, and it highlights this idea that even when we're dealing with supposedly fixed texts, meaning is fluid and always subject to change.
Okay, so what are some of the key phrases on the stele that might pique a listener's interest?
Well, there are a few that really stand out. For example, Ankhefunkhonsu proclaims his innocence, stating, "Do not stand up against me as a witness."
Wow.
He also claims to have joined those who are in the light and opened the abode of the stars.
That's pretty profound.
It is. Yeah. And then there's this very mysterious reference to the one who has only one arm who shines in the moon.
Who is this one-armed moonshining person?
It sounds like something straight out of a myth, right?
It does.
There are lots of different theories and interpretations about who or what this figure might represent, adding yet another layer of intrigue to the stele.
Right.
But what's clear is that the stele adds a whole other dimension to our understanding of Thelema and its potential connections to ancient Egyptian mysticism.
It definitely makes you wonder about all the historical connections that might be hidden beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And speaking of connections, we can't forget about the AA, which plays a crucial role in Thelema.
Right. You mentioned that earlier. It's a magical order.
It is.
But what does AA actually stand for?
Well, it's often said to stand for Argentium Astrum, which means silver star in Latin. But like many things in Thelema, the true meaning is often kind of hidden or veiled.
Yeah, very mysterious.
In symbolism.
Right.
What's important is that the AA is a magical order that's focused on spiritual development and helping individuals reach their highest potential. And our source material tells us that Liber LXI, Liber Causae, is especially important for understanding the history and purpose of the AA.
Okay, so what does Liber LXI tell us? What's the mission of the AA?
Well, in essence, it's to guide individuals towards their unknown crown.
Okay, their unknown crown.
Which is basically their highest spiritual potential.
Okay.
The truest version of themselves.
So they're big on self-discovery.
They are.
What about Crowley?
Right.
Wasn't he like a leader in the AA?
Well, that's an interesting point, because while Crowley was undoubtedly a key figure in the AA, The order actually believes very strongly in non-interference.
Okay, so how does that work?
The idea is that adepts, or those who've reached a high level within the order, act as guides, but they don't force or control others on their spiritual journeys.
So each individual has to kind of confront their own obstacles and things.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility for your own spiritual growth.
So it's more about empowerment than blind obedience?
Exactly.
Okay.
But you're right to bring up Crowley's personality.
Yeah.
Because as you might imagine, the AA, like many organizations, has had its share of internal conflicts and power struggles.
I bet, especially with somebody like Crowley involved.
Yeah, the source material even mentions that there were clashes between individuals who had different interpretations of Thelema and different ideas about how the order should be run.
So even in the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment, there's still like...
It seems that human nature always has a role to play, even in spiritual endeavors.
Yeah. Right. So tell me, what about the content of these books?
Ah, yes.
Like, what kind of wisdom or guidance do they actually offer?
Well, that's a great question. And it's one that every Thelemite grapples with in their own way.
Okay.
The themes in these books vary quite a bit, from practical instructions on magical practices to very deep philosophical reflections on the nature of reality and the self.
Wow. So it's not just like a how-to guide.
No, it's much more than that.
Yeah, it's like...
It's more like a guide to living a Thelemic life.
Right.
And remember how we talked about Crowley's motto?
Yeah.
By the force of truth, I have conquered the universe while living.
Right.
Well, that idea of personal will and the pursuit of truth pops up again and again throughout these books.
So it's not about just blindly following whatever Crowley said.
It's about finding your own truth.
Right. Okay, what about...
And another recurring theme is this idea of duality. Of opposites.
Like what kind of opposites?
Like light and darkness, male and female.
Okay.
These seemingly opposing forces are constantly being explored.
So like a yin and yang kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about finding balance and integrating these different aspects within yourself.
Right.
And this process of integration often involves confronting what's called the shadow self.
Okay.
The darker, hidden parts of ourselves.
Oh, now we're getting into like Jungian psychology.
Right, which is very much connected to Thelema as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. This reminds me of the Brothers of the Left-Hand Path.
Yeah.
That we talked about earlier.
Yeah. And in some esoteric traditions, the left-hand path is associated with going against the grain, questioning societal norms, and even embracing taboo practices as a means of achieving spiritual power.
So it's not necessarily about like, you know,
not necessarily
being evil or bad, but more about exploring like the unconventional.
It's about pushing boundaries and challenging the status quo. But it's important to note that this is just one interpretation. Thelema, like any spiritual system, is open to individual understanding and application.
Right. So there's no one right way to do it.
There's no one right way to do it.
Okay. So we've got this emphasis on textual purity, this focus on personal will and truth-seeking, and then these explorations of duality and integration.
Yeah.
What's the overall point of all of this?
Well, if we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, Thelema seems to be about empowering the individual and helping them to realize their full potential.
And like we said earlier, Thelema actually translates to will.
That's right.
So
it's about discovering and aligning with your true will, your purpose, and living a life that's in harmony with it.
That sounds like a pretty empowering philosophy.
It is.
Yeah.
But there's also this strong emphasis on taking responsibility for your actions and their consequences.
So no blaming the universe for your problems.
No blaming the universe.
You're in the driver's seat of your own life.
Exactly. You create your own reality. And these holy books are like a roadmap for that journey. They offer tools and insights that can help you to navigate the complexities of life and tap into your full potential.
So even with all this talk about divine inspiration and textual purity, it still comes down to like how you interpret it as an individual.
Exactly. And that's perhaps the most important takeaway from all of this. There's no one right way to understand or to practice Thelema. These texts are meant to spark your own inner journey. They're a starting point for exploration and self-discovery.
And that journey might lead you in some unexpected directions.
Definitely, because Thelema doesn't shy away from challenging conventional morality and societal norms.
One of the things that really jumped out at me from those excerpts was how sexuality was like a big theme in those texts.
It's true. Thelema views sexuality as a very powerful force that can be harnessed for spiritual growth.
That's pretty different
It is.
from a lot of other spiritual traditions.
It is, but it also raises some important questions about the ethical implications of such teachings.
Right, like where do you draw the line?
Exactly. How do you balance personal freedom with the potential for harm?
Right, it's like that old saying, your freedom to swing your fist.
Exactly.
Thelema, my nose begins.
That's right. And this is a tension that every Thelemite has to grapple with on their own terms.
So there's no easy answers.
There are no easy answers.
Okay.
Thelema is a system that demands active engagement, critical thinking, and a willingness to constantly question and evolve.
Okay, so it sounds like we've only just scratched the surface of this topic.
We have. There's so much more we could explore.
Yeah.
The symbolism, the rituals, the history.
The impact on modern culture.
Yeah, the impact of Thelema on modern culture. It's a fascinating world just waiting to be discovered.
It's like we've been given this key to this secret library filled with ancient wisdom and powerful knowledge.
And it's up to you, dear listener, to decide what you do with that key.
That's right.
Will you delve deeper into the mysteries of Thelema? Explore the writings of Crowley and his contemporaries? Or maybe seek out a community of like-minded individuals to share your interpretations and experiences?
Absolutely.
The path is open.
So keep seeking, keep questioning.
Yeah.
And keep diving deep.
Keep diving deep. So we were talking about how Thelema views sexuality as a powerful force that can be harnessed for spiritual growth.
Right. And that's pretty different from...
It is.
Yeah, from a lot of other spiritual traditions.
It is. And it also raises some really important questions about the ethical implications of those kinds of teachings. How do you balance personal freedom with the potential to, cause harm?
It's like that old saying, your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins.
Exactly. And that's a tension that I think every Thelemite has to grapple with on their own terms.
Right.
There are no easy answers.
Okay, so with all this talk about divine inspiration and textual purity, it still comes down to individual interpretation.
It does. And that's maybe the most important takeaway from all of this. There's no one right way to understand or practice Thelema.
Right.
These texts are really meant to spark your own inner journey.
Yeah.
It's a starting point for exploration and self-discovery.
So for our listeners out there, what would you say is like the biggest takeaway from this whole deep dive?
Well, I think the thing that keeps coming back to me is this idea of personal responsibility.
Okay.
Thelema really puts you in the driver's seat of your own life.
You create your own reality.
You create your own reality, exactly. Yeah. And these holy books offer a really unique perspective on how to do that.
Yeah.
They're filled with tools and insights that can help you navigate the complexities of life and tap into your full potential, but it's up to you to actually put those teachings into practice.
So it's not a passive thing. It's not like you just read these books and then enlightenment magically happens.
No, you have to actively engage with these ideas and be willing to put in the work.
So it's really about that idea of will that Thelema is all about.
That's it.
Okay, well, that's some really great food for thought, I think.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening who's intrigued by all of this, I definitely encourage you to check out those excerpts that we mentioned.
Absolutely.
And maybe even do a little digging of your own.
Yeah, explore the writings of Crowley and other Thelemites.
Yeah, see what resonates with you.
See what speaks to you.
Oh, right.
There's a whole world of fascinating ideas out there just waiting to be discovered.
It's been a really fascinating deep dive, and I think I've learned a lot about Thelema and these holy books.
Me too.
So thanks for sharing your knowledge.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners out there, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.